Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Niran Babalola. I work at Consensus on the diligence team where we focus on making sure that smart contracts are safe enough for people to use. In particular, I work on a product called Panvala. And what we're trying to do with Panvala is build a sustainable flow of funding for work that makes Ethereum safer. That work currently has a difficult time getting funded, and we want to make sure that it's easy. How about that? All right. So basically I'm going to start by talking about the problems that face decentralized governance systems, go into a couple of systems that have been deployed on the blockchain that people have governed, and then I'll give a high-level overview of how Slate Governance works and dive into how we're using it in Panvala in particular. So the first problem that a lot of systems end up having to tackle when they're trying to govern something on the blockchain is addressing 51% attacks. Whether you're dealing with hash power or token voting, if you can get 51% of the economic power in a system, you can effectively do whatever you want. Now, in the real world, if you were trying to govern a company and 51% of the shareholders tried to take 100% of the assets of a company, you would go to jail. It's not an area where code is law, it's an area where law is law. And the directors of a company have a fiduciary duty to represent the interests of all the shareholders, not just 51%. So there's a centralized backstop that prevents malicious proposals from going through. But in smart contracts, you don't have that centralized backstop. Code is law, for better or for worse. So a lot of the design decisions that people make are trying to accommodate that and make sure that 51% attacks aren't successful. Another problem that they have is decision overload. If you're trying to decentralize the governance of a system that's making a lot of decisions, a lot of the token holders are going to have to be active all the time to make all the decisions that need to be made. And sometimes the proposals that get made aren't even relevant. They're effectively spam, but to prevent them from going through, you have to show up and vote to make sure that the spam doesn't go through. So that's another thing that creates the pressure for a lot of design decisions that people make when they're governing these systems. Structurelessness is a problem that they run into when you're not a whale in one of these ecosystems where you're an insider who's involved in every decision. But if you're a small token holder and you have a proposal that you think is good for the system, there's no clear path to make that proposal get through. It's kind of hidden. We've defined decentralization in a lot of circumstances to mean chaos. So there's no defined process for you to know how to get the support of 51% of the token holders so you could get your good proposal approved. So rather than distributing power to all the participants in the system, power ends up being centralized with the active participants with the most tokens that they hold. Deadlocks are a problem that occur when you're not just dealing with simple binary decisions where we're trying to choose between path A or path B, but in the real world there's so many decisions that we can make together and so many options that we can choose from. One example of this right now is Brexit in the UK. There's no majority to stay in the European Union. There's no majority to leave the European Union with no deal, but there's also no majority for the deal that's actually on the table. So they're stuck in a deadlock and nobody really knows what the path forward is. Building governance systems that avoid deadlocks helps cooperation continue over time, and we need to design systems that can achieve that. Disunity becomes a problem when you're not sure that your rights as a minority token holder will be respected when 51% of the participants decide something else. If you think that your rights won't be respected, you're probably not going to join the system. But the flip side of that is if it's so easy to leave the system when decisions don't go your way, then it's easier to split than it is to stay together and keep on cooperating. So systems need to strike a balance between making sure that you're not tied into decisions that other people are making for you, but also to be sticky enough that people keep cooperating over time. And lastly, cartel resistance is a big problem that I don't have enough time to go to in detail, but basically if you were trying to use a token governance system to, for instance, allocate the block reward from a blockchain, the optimal strategy for someone proposing how to use those tokens that they're getting is to bribe as many of the voters as possible, basically just pay them off, and you end up not achieving what you set out to do. You were trying to get those tokens to go towards work that improved the network, but instead it's either going back to the voters or going to the pockets of the cartel that's formed. So the first system that I'll talk about is the DAO. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the DAO. In mid-2016, the Ethereum network had been live for less than a year. And a lot of people were really excited about the potential to create new kinds of organizations that didn't have CEOs, they didn't have officers at all, they were governed from the bottom up. So one of the first design decisions that the DAO made was proposals would be submitted to a set of curators who could veto any proposals before they got to the token holders. So if you take the 51% attack problem, if those curators see a proposal that's trying to take 100% of the assets of the organization and give it to 51% of the token holders, they can just veto it and never present it for a vote. So that doesn't become a problem. When you have that spam problem with decision overload, the curators can do the same thing. They can decide, we're going to hold off on these things that you're proposing because it's not worth the attention of the token holders. So that design decision solves two of those problems. The other design decision that they made is the losing side of a vote can always exit the DAO and split. Everyone else who wants to split ends up forming a new DAO that can go on and continue cooperating with a subset of the people who are on the same side of the split as you. So that makes it very easy to decide to participate in a system like this. If you know that if a decision doesn't go your way, you can always take your ball and go home, then there's no reason to not join in the first place, except for the fact that the DAO had a bug. It was a small problem. But if you're not familiar with the backstory of the DAO, I highly recommend reading the Wired article that takes you through the story. It was kind of like living through a science fiction novel. You should really be familiar with that story. So after the DAO failed, Aragon kind of picked up the ball of the enthusiasm behind these decentralized organizations and built a framework for creating new kinds of organizations. It's effectively a toolkit for building new organizations. So the most interesting Aragon DAO right now is the DAO that they're using to govern themselves through what they call the Aragon Governance Process, or AGPs. So the core of Aragon has a feature called access control lists, and that's the method that they delegate different rights and responsibilities within their organizations. So the design decision that they made for the AGP process is that they would have AGP editors, which are basically two people that are the only ones that have a right to create a proposal for the token holders to vote on. So again, if you have a 51% attack proposal that's trying to take all the assets and give it to 51% of the voters, the AGP editors can just say, we're not going to ever present that to the voters because it's a bad proposal. And if they're spam, they can also say, not going to include that. It solves those two problems. But again, there's no one Aragon way to solve the various governance problems. It's really a toolkit for creating your own organizations that solve these problems. So if you're trying to experiment with decentralized organizations, you should really start with building on top of Aragon. They've solved a lot of problems for you, and it's structured in a way where you could plug in what you're trying to innovate on without having to resolve all those problems from scratch. Use Aragon. So Moloch DAO is one of the interesting experiments happening right now. It launched on the mainnet, I think, 2 days ago. And what they're trying to do is build a grant-making DAO, basically a DAO that raises funds and starts spending those funds on things that improve the Ethereum ecosystem. So the way that it works is the existing members can make proposals to add new members. And adding new members is basically just giving them voting weight in the system. New members are either doing work, so they're getting voting weight for free, or they're putting in money and they're getting voting weight because they're contributing to the organization. So to make one of those proposals, you have to put down a 10 Ether deposit to prevent spam. And if, again, just like the DAO, if you're on the losing side of a vote, there's a waiting period before those proposals will take effect. So if you don't want your assets to be taken into that decision, you can take your assets and go home. It doesn't create a new DAO like the DAO did, so hopefully it'll be a little more secure. But since you're never obligated to abide by the decisions of the majority, it really makes total sense to participate from day one. So I highly encourage people to participate in this Moloch DAO experiment. There's really no reason not to, except for the fact that you might lose your funds in a smart contract bug, but that's a risk that we all take when we use these systems. Put in however much you're willing to risk to smart contracts and have fun with the experiment that's going on. Lastly, MakerDAO is the DAO that operates the DAI stablecoin that hopefully a lot of you have played with here at the conference. They have a couple of different types of governance proposals, but the one that's most interesting to me is their executive proposals that actually take effect on chain. To govern these, they use a system that they call continuous approval voting. So you can make as many proposals as you want during a quarter, but at the end of the quarter, the proposal with the most votes is the one that's going to take effect. So if there are 7 different proposals and you think 3 of them are okay and 4 of them are total crap, then you vote for all 3 of the ones that you approve of, and whichever proposal ends up having the most votes is the one that's going to take effect. So this is interesting to me because it's very similar to what we're doing with Slate Governance. So with Slate Governance, the hypothesis behind it, the reason that we built it in the first place, is because our community strongly believes in decentralization. And decentralization is a good thing. I'm not anti-decentralization. But a lot of people don't have the same definition of decentralization. If you ask 2 different people, they're going to give you 2 different answers. The only thing that we agree on is if we see a system where chaos reigns, then that's decentralized. But it doesn't have to be that way. To me, what decentralization means is that you have an emergent order rather than a top-down order. And if we can build decentralized systems that facilitate that emergent order, we could probably get a lot more work done together than we're currently getting done right now. So at a high level, the way that Slate Governance works is that there's one slate of proposals that can execute each quarter. Slate can have as many proposals as you want to include on it, and there can be as many slates as you want competing with each other to be that one slate that's going to execute that quarter. But at the end of the day, the one with the most votes is the one that's going to execute. Secondly, if there's only one slate, then there's no vote at all. If there was no competition to be that slate that's going to execute this quarter, just execute the one that seems to be the consensus of the community and move forward without a vote. Third, the identity of the recommender of each slate is emphasized in our voting process. Instead of it just being a purely technical decision, we care about who's making the recommendations for these slates in our system. And last, anytime you're making a proposal, you're recommending a slate of proposals, you have to stake tokens on that slate. And any of the losing slates for that quarter are going to lose the tokens that they staked on that slate. So that's how it works at a high level. And the outcomes that we desire from that is that really consensus is built before votes ever happen. If you look at a lot of the existing systems where decentralized governance is happening, the conversation really starts when the proposals hit the chain. That's when people are trying to figure out what they're going to vote for and how things should proceed. We don't think that's the right way to do things. We think it should be more like the philosophy behind plasma, where you set up a set of rules where you can coordinate off-chain, and you only go back to the chain when something has gone terribly wrong. That's when lots of transactions get sent. And Panvala, if there's just one slate that everybody agrees on, that's the normal case scenario. One transaction got sent, you had one slate for that quarter, it gets executed. But when something goes wrong, when someone submits a slate that wasn't actually the consensus of the community, that's when more transactions are going to be sent to recommend more slates. And that's when hundreds or thousands of transactions are going to be sent to vote in the system. But that only happens when stuff goes wrong, not in the normal case. We want consensus to be formed off-chain, not on. So in this system, we rely heavily on incumbency. So when we're deciding which slate to vote on, in the app, we highlight who the incumbent recommender is. If you recommended the last slate that was successful, the next time you propose a slate, we're going to make sure that the community knows that you're the same person that recommended the last slate. And that's important to us because it establishes a different status quo from what usually prevails in decentralized systems. In most systems, the status quo is stasis. It's hard to make changes in most decentralized systems because by default, nothing happens. But in Slate Governance, there's a different status quo. The status quo is continued progress along the same trajectory that the community has been moving on. Because when voters are comfortable with the status quo, they vote for the incumbent, not for nothing. We think we can get more sustained progress when the status quo is progress, not stasis. Secondly, we rely on a top 2 runoff when there's more than 3 slates present for a quarter. So by default, if you're just going to vote on slates and there are 7 slates in a quarter, you could get a slate that wins with 30% of the vote. And that might not actually be an accurate representation of the consensus of the community. So one way to address that is by doing something like instant runoff voting, where you just rank all the slates and have the algorithm go through a runoff one at a time. But then you get into that same scenario where you're reaching that consensus on chain of which slate was actually the consensus of the community. And that's not what we want to happen. We want people to build consensus off chain and then publish it to the chain. So that's why we use a top two runoff. So when you're voting, you select your first choice of a slate and your second choice of a slate. And we count up all of the first choice votes. And if one of those slates gets 50% or more, then that's cool, that one wins, and there's no runoff. But if none of the slates get 50% of the vote, that's when the top two runoff kicks off. We eliminate all of the slates that didn't get either the top amount of first choice votes or the second top amount of first choice votes. We take all the ballots from the people whose first choice was eliminated, and then we count up their second choice, and that's how we determine who wins out of the remaining two slates. So we think that kind of coerces people into reaching consensus off-chain rather than relying on the outcome of a vote to determine what the consensus actually was. This solution isn't a cure-all. It doesn't solve all the problems when it comes to splintering in a decentralized system. It's really similar to how the president is elected in France. They use a top two runoff. And in their last election, there was a candidate on the left, a candidate on the right, and one right down the middle. And the voting system did its job, like it steered people towards the middle ground candidate, but they also have riots in the street every weekend. The voting system doesn't guarantee that you're gonna be able to build unity over time, but what we're using it for is to make sure that consensus is built off-chain rather than being built on-chain. So of those governance problems I outlined to begin with, 51% attacks and decision overload are very commonly solved. Almost every one of these systems solves that, so does Slate Governance. For structurelessness, instead of not knowing where to go, if you're a small token holder with a good proposal, you know you can go to the incumbent recommender and figure out how to get your proposal into their slate. For deadlocks, we try to address that with incumbency. We want there to always be someone who has a mandate to continue to make recommendations, but that doesn't mean that's gonna solve all the problems. Again, going back to the Brexit example, there's an incumbent, there's a prime minister with a mandate to lead, but there's still a deadlock, they're still stuck. So Slate Governance also does not completely solve the deadlock problem, but I think we can solve it. For disunity, we still have that problem where you might be reluctant to enter a system governed by Slate Governance if you think your rights won't be respected. If you put your assets in, and then 51% of the voters decide to do something you didn't like, then you're kind of stuck. So it doesn't solve that problem directly. And cartel resistance, it also doesn't solve that. If you try to use Slate Governance to govern the inflation of a currency for a blockchain, you're probably gonna end up with a cartel. They're gonna put that money in their pocket and you're not gonna achieve the goal. So we don't solve those last three problems in Slate Governance itself. We solve those problems by choosing what to govern. We believe that instead of governing assets on chain, you should govern loyalty. We're not pooling some funds in a smart contract and determining how to govern it. We're governing how we interact as a community together. And to explain how that works, I'll dive deeper into how we're using Slate Governance in Panvala in particular. So what Panvala does is it uses tokens to organize people who want to make Ethereum safer. Right now, there's work that needs to be done to make sure that smart contracts do what people say that they do. And we also have a vision that we've been telling people about what Ethereum is, and for it to fulfill that vision, the network has to scale. So what we're trying to do is organize people who want to make sure that smart contracts are secure, and people who want to make sure that the network scales, and get them to support the people who are doing that work. So the core problem that we're facing is that the ecosystem funding is unsustainable. A lot of the common infrastructure that we all rely on is being funded by one team or another that raised funds in a one-shot deal. And they're spending down those funds, and eventually they're gonna run out. The second problem that we're facing is that the incentive system that allowed us to build Ethereum in the first place doesn't really work for improving the system over time. It's easy to get people to start a new network, but it's not easy to get people to improve an existing one. So people with ideas about how to scale the network, instead of cooperating with the existing community, sometimes they splinter off, create their own new incentive systems, and build something separate that competes. If we want to be able to make more progress together instead of splitting apart, we have to solve this problem. The way that Panvala solves this problem is by wrapping the existing ecosystem of grant funders, corporate open source projects, and volunteers with a token that gives them a shared incentive to find sustainable funding together. So we start off the system with just a plain old ERC20 token, and we take half of the supply, the fixed supply of that token, and we put it into a smart contract that we call the token capacitor. And what the token capacitor does is it releases tokens at a decaying rate over time for token holders to distribute the way that they want. Every 4 years, the amount that you have available cuts in half, just like the Bitcoin block reward. So every quarter, the token capacitor releases some tokens, and the token holders decide what they're going to issue tokens to reward. They're going to find people who are doing work that aligns with the mission, and they're going to issue those tokens to the teams that are doing the best work. But those workers with those tokens in their hands, that doesn't really give them anything if those tokens aren't useful for something else. And what those tokens are for is for donors to buy tokens from them and deposit back into the system. So Panvala isn't a system that controls your assets. You don't put dollars in Panvala. You don't put Ether in Panvala. You don't put DAI. Instead, when you want to donate to the system, you buy tokens from someone who did work and earn tokens for that work. You give them dollars, and you deposit the tokens that you purchased back into the system to keep the system issuing grants over time. So that's one way to get tokens to go back into the system and complete that cycle. But Panvala doesn't need your money. What it really needs is your power. We want you to use your loyalty to make donations happen to Panvala. And the way that you do that is being loyal to the merchants, the companies, and the individuals that make donations to Panvala. There's a lot of money that companies currently set aside, whether it's your local coffee shop, your cloud services, or your favorite luxury car brand. They have a marketing budget that they spend to get you in the door. And they're giving that money to Facebook and Google to make that happen. But with Panvala, what we can do is, instead of spending that money with Facebook and Google and making them richer, we can get companies to put money towards a goal that we care about, to fund work that we care about and go into the door for that reason. We want to give the same return on investment that you get for paying for ads from Facebook and Google, but for putting donations towards a cause that we care about. So the more demand there is to make contributions to the system, the easier it is to fund the work that we're trying to do together. Workers are getting tokens from the token capacitor. Donors are buying tokens from the workers and getting those tokens from them. And then they put those tokens back into the token capacitor to complete the cycle. Our goal is to reach equilibrium. For every token that's going out of the system as a grant, we want one token to be going back into the system as a donation. And when we reach equilibrium, that's a level of cooperation that we can sustain indefinitely. It's not that people are speculating on this token, hoping that it'll increase in value. It's that we've organized a community of donors, organized a community of workers, and brought them together so they can fund the work that they want to do together. So when you have a system like this that can fund work, how do you govern it? That's what we designed Slate Governance to do, and it's already in progress. We released the first batch of token grants on February 1st. And the way that we did it was we started accepting applications from teams in the community. We put together a packet of all those applications, and we created the Panvala Awards Committee to make the first recommendation for a slate of grants to release. So we sat down and we had a meeting, which we recorded. It's on our YouTube channel, the Panvala YouTube channel, so you can watch how it played out. At the end of the day, they recommended a slate of grants. We had applications. We had 12 applications from 10 teams, and those applications requested 2.6 million tokens. But the token capacitor for the first batch restricts us to 2.1 million tokens. So the applicants had two options. They could decide to reduce the amount of tokens that they're awarding, that they're requesting to make sure that every application could fit in under the limit. Or they could hold the line and say, I'm not going to reduce the number of tokens that I'm requesting. I'm willing to see some of the people be bumped out, even if it's me. But what they all decided is that they would reduce the amount that they requested, and we were able to issue grants to all of the people that applied. In batch 2, we won't have 2.1 million tokens, we'll have 2 million tokens. That's what the capacitor is going to release in batch 2. So more applications will come in by April 5th. We'll have another meeting where the Panvala Awards Committee decides which applications to recommend, and we'll release the second batch of tokens that way. So that's one side of how the system works. That's how we get tokens to people who are doing the work. But what about how we get donors to actually put tokens back into the system? That's where you come in. We want to demonstrate here this weekend at ETH Denver that even without putting your money directly into the system to make donations happen, that you can use your loyalty to make donations happen. We want you to use the Ally Guide as the way that you decide which businesses to patronize here at ETH Denver. And again, our goal is to convince businesses that instead of giving money to Facebook and Google to make people come in the door, that they could give money to a cause that we care about and get our community to come into the door. We want to give them the same return on investment for every dollar that they're currently spending on advertising, but instead of spending it on advertising, they're going to spend it on making Ethereum safer. That's our goal. That's the problem that faces us. But that's a problem that we're going to solve. And there's a lot more problems in this world that are more important than making Ethereum safer. They're huge, but we're not helpless in the face of these problems. We're mankind. Solving problems is what we do. And if we can figure out how to cooperate and then show the world, there's no problem that we can't tackle together. So let's start here today. Let's start here this weekend. Join us, become a Panvala ally. Let's make Ethereum safer, then find out what we're capable of. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Any questions? Yes. The convergence model? Emergence. So the idea is that people, like, as an individual, it's hard to get your single proposal through the entire system. The idea is that you have to organize with people who've already been getting proposals through the system. And if the community doesn't like the current process that the incumbent recommender is making, then they can compete with them. Start a separate recommender with a separate process and convince the token holders to go behind them instead. Instead of just being isolated individual actors in the system, we want people to organize together and decide what the consensus of the community is. I'm not sure if it's exactly that, but the idea is just in general, if you have these constraints, the optimal strategy to play is to find all the other people who can put together a process that can maintain the trust of the community and work with them to get a recommendation through, to get 51% of the votes, and to get those proposals enacted. All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Become a Panvala ally. This is the Ally Guide. There's businesses on it that you should support, and you'll get a badge every time you shop there, and send us a receipt. So get this from me. Or go to ally.panvala.com.